my coming to sociocracy was, I would say, ultimately through a graduate program I did at the very end of the 20th century, meaning I finished in December 99. And it led me from a focus on ecological design, which is part of my background, to a focus on human systems design. And in terms of, I stumbled over sociocracy as a system in about 2000. And then I kind of kept looking for more, and there wasn't a lot in the United States, in the English-speaking world, until 2007, when We the People, the first edition, was published. And then I was able to really get engaged and ended up being one of the co-founders of our consulting group. And I've been working with that ever since. And I think what I will say is, I found I was looking at working with human systems, and I was finding approaches that were parts and pieces and elements that didn't really connect strongly. And when I stumbled over the Sociocratic circle method, it was like, yes, here we go. Here is a whole systems design for doing this kind of thing. So that's me. I'll give it over to Sheella for a quick intro.
Morning, everybody, or whatever it is in your part of the world. It's early morning for me. My name is Sheella Mierson. I found Sociocracy about 10 years ago, and am also one of the co-founders of the Sociocracy Consulting Group. In my first life, I was a biomedical research scientist, and I became very interested in how people collaborated or not, both in the laboratory and in the classroom, and eventually left science and, well, left that way of doing science anyway, and started a consulting group, a consulting company, and then found Sociocracy, I think I said about 10 years ago. I'm also a facilitator for the Blueprint of We collaboration process, which helps people collaborate more effectively. So back to you, John, for our topic today.
So Sheella, we have some slides. Sheila's going to start a screen share for us, and I'm just going to say a few things about our topic and why might we care about collective intelligence in general. So just a few points to offer. We're social beings. We don't thrive in isolation, and the manner in which we socialize, in which we interact, makes a difference in our experience of life. If we think about, a spectrum with, at one end you have something like a dictatorship where everything is controlled by one person or some small group of people, and at the other end you have, relative chaos and complete lack of organization. Those don't tend to be satisfying contexts for humans. We want some for humans. We want something more in between, where we connect with each other, we work together. Also, those extremes are, as we'll see as we look at some research info here, those extremes are less intelligent. We are less intelligent as a group in those ways. Coordinating what we do through this language that we have, it's a fundamental part of being human. So this is kind of built into us, and let's see what we can find out about it and how to make it better. Go ahead with that next slide, Sheella. There's a gentleman named Tom Atlee who has an interesting reflection. He's an American. He was a Quaker, social and peace and environmental activist, and an author. And he's co-founder of something called the Co-Intelligence Institute, which has a project called Wise Democracy. You can find that, or I can send links later on. And so he had this observation, he says, as humans, we have this innate ability to gather and analyze data as individuals, but we're also affected by culture, by whatever our education system is, by social institutions. And an individual person tends to make decisions motivated by their self-preservation. So he says, without collective intelligence, we might drive ourselves to extinction based on our selfish individual needs. In other words, he's suggesting that collective intelligence might actually be essential to our survival, because without collective thinking, we might just selfishly make such a big mess that we can't survive it. And I invite you to consider the empirical evidence from some of the very hyper-individualistic cultures that we have happening right now, and where those seem to take us. So it's just a little bit about, why care about this? Why does it matter to us as a species? And we have a couple brief stories from our own experience about seeing this collective intelligence happen in an organization that we're working with, just to give you a sense of how it can happen. So Sheella has one she's going to start with. Go ahead, Sheella. I'll pass it back to you.
So this is a story of where it was clear to me that the group was being smarter than an individual, or even several of the individuals. This is from a company called FormFlow in Australia, and they make they design and build machines to manufacture specialized metal equipment. And we were facilitating a policy meeting that they had. They needed a naming system for their machines so that both they and the clients would be clear about what machine they were talking about. So in a sociocratic policy meeting that we facilitated, someone brought a proposal for how to name a new machine. And I had seen the proposal ahead of time. It looked straightforward to me going into that meeting. But from the questions and reactions rounds in the sociocratic meeting, it became apparent that they needed a more general scheme that would accommodate other machines in the future. So what they ended up doing was consenting to a modified version of the original proposal that would be good enough for a couple months on a trial period. But then the next meeting, they will expand that, and somebody's going to put together another proposal that will be able to handle all their machines in the future. So when I first thought of this example, it seemed to me to be sort of humdrum. And then I realized that it seemed that way because I've gotten so used to this happening in a policy meeting that what seems like a simple proposal crafted by one person turns into a much better proposal during the meeting. So it's just an example of the group mind. Okay, John, you have another example for us as well.
Yeah, and this one, so Sheila's was something that happened, kind of in the course of one meeting, a quick, form of collective intelligence happening. Mine is much longer term. I've worked with an organization called Open Floor International, which was the means of a small group of co-founders of putting into the world their synthesis from 30 plus years of experience of something in the world of conscious movement and dance, as it's called. Conscious movement is, well, if you've heard of 5 rhythms, for example, that's sort of the contemporary origins of that. Anyway, the point being, the founders initially decided to create their organization as a limited liability company. This is in the United States. So for those not familiar, really quickly, an LLC is kind of the simplest form of incorporation here in the United States. It's very flexible, it's easy to do, and importantly, you have very few restrictions on how you govern yourselves. And they knew from the start they wanted to operate sociocratically. And so this was a way where they could pretty much write their own rules for how the organization would be run. They weren't constrained by state law or federal law in certain ways that other entities would limit their ability to do that. And they also thought about being a nonprofit organization, often called a charity in many other parts of the world, some kind of charity organization. And they decided there would be too many constraints on how to govern, and they would need a board and so on and so forth that didn't seem to fit what they wanted. So they created an LLC and they launched the organization. And over years of time, the way I saw it as an occasional consultant to their unfolding, the collective intelligence of the group slowly but surely pointed them towards shifting from an LLC to a nonprofit organization for a number of reasons that I won't go into the details, with the point being it was this sort of ongoing feedback and realization, and they went through a few changes in the structure and how the circles were organized and how they were linked, that ultimately led them to go, you know, that just doesn't make sense anymore. We really should be a nonprofit, and that's going to fit what we're doing now as we've matured better than how we started. So I could say there was collective intelligence at the start, that an LLC is the right thing. And then eventually that collective intelligence learned that it was time for a change. So that's a long-term example. So back to Sheella now. Let's look at some research findings on this collective intelligence thing we've been talking about.
So how does this happen that a group is smarter collectively than they are together? Psychologists have found that a single statistical factor, often called general intelligence, emerges from correlations among people's performance on a wide variety of cognitive tasks. And the question is whether a similar kind of collective intelligence exists at all for groups of people. So there was a study published in 2010 in Science magazine, and we'll have the list of references available later for people who wanted it, that showed that in fact a collective intelligence factor does exist that explains a group's performance on a wide variety of tasks. So their initial studies involved groups of 2 to 5 people working on a diverse set of tasks. And they came up with the C factor, which is defined as the general ability of a group to perform a wide variety of tasks. So then they asked, well, what determines this C factor? What contributes to it? And there are a number of things that people might expect to predict group performance that turn out not to be correlated with the C factor at all. One of them is the average, either not at all or only very mildly. So the average or maximal intelligence of the group members does not correlate strongly with the C factor. And then there's some other things that you might expect would be correlated, such as group cohesion, motivation of group members, satisfaction of group members. And it turns out that none of those do. So what does correlate turns out to be 3 things. So the first is the average social sensitivity of the group members. So this is a fancy way of saying that group members are skilled at intuiting how others feel based on tone of voice, expressions, or other facial expressions or other nonverbal cues. And people on the more successful teams scored above average on the test that they used, which is called the reading the mind in the eyes test. So they're shown pictures of people's eyes and asked to say what the person is feeling. And the people who did better on that test seemed to know when someone was feeling upset or left out. Sorry, the people in the teams that had a higher collective intelligence seemed to know when somebody was feeling upset or left out, or when they were feeling excited. And people on the ineffective teams, in contrast, scored below average. They seemed as a group to have less sensitivity toward their colleagues. So that's the first factor. The second factor is we might call conversational turn taking. So the C factor that measures collective intelligence is negatively, so this is for people who have a little bit of a bent towards statistics, but I'll make that part very brief. The C factor is, is negatively correlated with the variance in the number of speaking turns by group members. What that means is that groups where a few people dominate the conversation are less collectively intelligent than those with a more equal distribution of conversational turn taking. You can probably see where we're going to go with this for sociocracy. And there's a third factor that turns out to correlate strongly, and that is the proportion of females in the group. So you may recognize some of these women. This is a composite picture of 5 national leaders, prime ministers, or whatever their title is, of governments now. It turns out there have been several articles recently that the countries that are headed by women, the countries that are faring best in the COVID-19 pandemic are ones that are headed by women. There's some others too that are not in this picture. So this is not one specific group, but it's just, I love this picture. However, so groups with a higher proportion of females in a group have greater collective intelligence. However, it turns out not to be an independent effect. It's mediated by social sensitivity. Both these researchers and earlier researchers found that women in general score higher on the social sensitivity measure than men. So there's really just the two factors that explain most of the data, and that is the social sensitivity and the conversational turn taking. I might add that the company of Google, since about 2012, has been embarking on an initiative codenamed Project Aristotle to study hundreds of Google's teams and figure out why some stumble while others soar. Google has a large people operations department, and they make measurements and run statistical analyses of lots of factors that may be affecting their teams. It's actually very interesting. This is one of the references in our reference list, if you want it. But what they have found confirms the studies of collective intelligence. So the collective intelligence is different from the individual intelligence. And in the same way, individuals have self-awareness, and we all work to become more self-aware. A lot of people work to become more self-aware, but it turns out that a collection of people with self-awareness is not enough, that there's something called collaborative awareness that is actually, it's a horse of a different color. And it does connect with the studies of psychological safety. I look forward to hearing Francine's session later. It was too early in the morning for me to get, but there are some tie-ins with the studies of psychological safety. So now we'll talk a little bit about how the sociocratic circle method supports collective intelligence. The first one is turn taking, and that leads to equivalence of voices. And that's in a couple of ways. It's primarily from rounds in the meeting, but it's also from the double linking, which means that there's going to be some equivalence between voices from different parts of the organization. And John's going to talk about the social sensitivity now. John, you're mute.
Thank you. So that turn-taking piece is fairly well baked into, how we do sociocracy in multiple ways. The social sensitivity, we're going to look at a minute in other ways to build that, but it is baked into the SCM as well in a number of ways that I'm just going to point out briefly. One of those is that we don't just take turns speaking in rounds when we're doing our meeting processes. We take turns listening, because ideally those of us who aren't speaking are listening, and we're listening attentively because we really want to hear what our colleagues are putting out there for the collective intelligence. And the meeting structure itself includes pieces that help us connect with each other, such as the opening round, where we kind of tune in and get ourselves together to do the work that we're going to do. And the closing rounds, where we collectively hear from each other on how did the meeting go, what went well, what could we do to make it better, and those sorts of things. So those contribute as well to building our social sensitivity. It's not guaranteed, but there's always those opportunities, and they happen every time we meet. Another one is the facilitator is ideally the point person who's paying attention to body language, facial expression, vocal expression, and tone of voice. And of course, the facial expression and tone of voice are particularly valuable in virtual meetings where you can't see the rest of the whole person and we're not all in the same room. And so the facilitator is typically a person, ideally, who has either is working to build their social sensitivity or has a bit more to start with Of course, anyone in the circle can hold that and use it to the benefit of the whole circle, but it's often the facilitator that takes the lead on that. And we have a facilitating sociocracy training where one of the things we work with is building that awareness of nonverbal signals, vocal signals, and paying attention to how people are doing emotionally. And so there's that facilitator role. Another piece is that when we work with objections, or when we raise objections or believe we have an objection, that isn't just an intellectual experience. It may be, but it can be a felt sense. It can be a gut feeling. It can be a whole body experience. You know, the nervousness in the stomach around this proposal, the slight headache I'm getting as we talk about this, all those kinds of things we take into account, and that's part of the social sensitivity awareness, that it's more than just our sort of cognitive intellectual parts that are important here. Our emotions, our felt sense, our whole body experience are part of the communication processes, and we make that explicit when we're working sociocratically. So that also adds to attention to social sensitivity. And this, I think this speaks the third factor, which is the proportion of females, which basically contributes because on average, women are more socially sensitive than men. I think that's a call to, to us men to up our game in that area and, be able to contribute more in that way. So that's something that we can do specifically. So there's some ways that Sociocratic approach specifically invites the social sensitivity and the turn taking, and Sheila's going to just run down a few complementary systems that we're going to name out, and some of you will be familiar and some may not, and then we will have a bit of time left for questions. Go ahead, Sheila.
Okay, so John talked about how sociocracy builds collective intelligence, and now we want to see what can we learn from these studies of collective intelligence that we can make use of in sociocracy. So the one that the turn taking is pretty well taken care of. So I'm going to focus on increasing social sensitivity. This is just some that we thought of. You may have others to add to this list. The first is any kind of training or practice in active listening, or training to increase emotional intelligence. Nonviolent communication is another way of increasing social sensitivity, as is the Blueprint of We collaboration process that provides a document and a process to help people collaborate more effectively, make agreements, and increase their sensitivity towards each other, have more of a we mind. Any kind of mindfulness practices can contribute to this. Improvisational theater and playback theater can help build social sensitivity, and oftentimes experiential group therapy context can contribute to it. Back to you, John. John, you're mute.
Thank you. I'm so well behaved, except on the unmuting part. So thank you, Sheila. So at this point, if people have any questions on what we've presented, please go with that. Jerry, I'm not sure if you have a way of seeing more people than I do, or just unmute yourself and speak up. And if you have any ideas to add to our list, just name those for people also, of other ways that might build the social sensitivity piece.
Well, I might add just one of those other things. This is Jerry. All the different kinds of workshops there are to increase your understanding of racism and sexism and classism and homophobia and all those elements, that it's useful for all of us to have a deeper understanding of, particularly of what we don't experience ourselves.
That's great. That's
Yes.
great, Jerry. I'm going to
Thank
add
you,
it to
Jerry.
our list.
Mm-hmm. Okay, other questions or comments? can only see half or less of you at once, so I would say just unmute and speak out.
And there's a number of things going on through the chat
Yeah,
here.
I'm jumping to the chat. It's
Oh, somebody asked about the research citation. I can give that now. I'll call that up.
yeah, emotional intelligence. Yes. Yeah, we'll have a link to the research, the original research paper we found, and a few things that are related with it. In just a second, I'll put our emails in the chat, and you can just mail either of us and get that. So yeah, a bunch of people were saying, where's the research citation? So we'll send that out to anybody who asks for it. And Miguel asks, all the things in slide 10 and 11 are also supporting collaborative intelligence. Is that right? I believe so. Is that correct, Sheila, from your understanding?
Hold on, I'm looking up which slides those were.
Yeah.
That they're also supporting. I'm sorry.
Collaborative intelligence.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's correct. They are.
Yep. Yep.
And somebody, Rachel said, something else which could be helpful to increase sensitivities is work on trauma. So yes, any kind of trauma work. That was kind of that last item of experiential group therapy work, which is part of my experience. Can we share the slides? Yeah, I believe they're going to be, I mean, this will be available as a recording, but we can also share the slide deck itself.
So let me just mention here, we're offering two things, and we can also include the slides in that list of references that we used for this presentation, and a one-page sheet called 3 Tips for Meetings That Sizzle, which is a little bit about why rounds are so effective and some ways to use them, most of which you'll be at least familiar with if you have sociocratic meetings, but there may be some new ideas for you there.